Fáilte, and welcome to episode number 2 of Ancient Landscapes with myself, Tine. In this 6-part series, I will be selecting some of my favourite landscapes in Ireland's ancient East and taking a journey back through the ages to uncover some of their hidden mysteries. We'll explore the ruins of some of our most famous landmarks and the myth and legends which reside there, with interviews from experts and amateur enthusiasts alike to guide us along the way. In the last episode, we travelled down one of the 5 ancient roads which led to Ireland's political centre at Tara in County Meath, the Great Slí Luachra, which would likely have passed right through the ancient centre of Dundalk. In this episode, entitled Queen Maebh in Dundalgan, we follow another infamous pathway which passed through Dundalk town. This time we're turning our attentions to the epic saga of An Tónbó Cúailnge, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, guided by Thomas Kinsella's 1969 translation of the tale itself, as well as a conversation with Professor Paul Gosling, an expert on the topography and place names featured in the story. The tale begins in the seat of Queen Maebh's power at Rathcroghan in County Roscommon. The catalyst for the gruesome events of the Táin was a seemingly innocent comment made by her husband Ailill McMadden one night as the power couple lay in bed. "It is true what they say, love," said Ailill. "It is well for the wife of a wealthy man." "True enough," answered Maebh. "What put that into your mind?" Ailill's explanation stated that he was merely thinking about how much better off she was now than the day she married him. Maebh took issue at his stance, and so began a heated, night-long game of one-upmanship. Maebh and Ailill compared their many belongings and assets in an effort to discover which of them had more at the beginning of their marriage and which of them had more now. What many retellings of the tale don't make clear is the context for this argument. In Lawrence Ginnell's late 19th century writings about Ireland's ancient Brehon laws, he explains that the ancient Celtic family was not constructed like the modern family. There were several different types of marriage which dictated the rights and responsibilities of each party and their families, depending on the status of the parties at the time the marriage was initiated. Marriage was very much seen as a business contract. In Maebh and Ailill's case, theirs was a marriage of equals, where both parties had entered into the union with exactly equal status, properties and wealth. In a marriage of equals, Maebh was free to maintain her own business contracts and her rightful rule of connacht, for which she had been chosen by the nobles of the province from amongst several of her siblings, because she was the highest and haughtiest of them all. However, after their night-long argument and comparing everything they possessed, it was discovered that Ailill had gained a higher status than Maebh when an impressive bull, born of her herd and named Findabair, had crossed over into Ailill's herd and therefore become his property. According to the medieval monks who first wrote down the tale of the Táin, this was because the bull didn't want to be ruled by a woman. This discovery would have dire consequences for Maebh and her rulership over Connacht. If their marriage was no longer equal and Maebh was indeed a kept woman, then the rulership of Connacht and her father's legacy of power there would presumably have passed to her husband, who had not earned it by any means. This may have brought untold consequences and discord to Connacht and could not be tolerated, and so it was decided right there in her royal suite in Roscommon that the balance needed to be restored and redressed. Initially, Maebh tried to strike a deal with the owner of the Brown Bull of Cooley, the only bull in Ireland who could equal Findabair and restore the balance of power. The deal she proposed stated that he would lend her the Brown Bull, or Dún Cúailnge, for a year, after which she would not only give him the bull back, but in addition she would give him 50 yearling heifers, a portion of the fine plain of equal to his own lands, a chariot worth thrice 7 bondmaids, and her own friendly thighs. It should be noted at this point that polygamy was not necessarily considered immoral in ancient Ireland, and Maebh had been upfront with Ailill about her extramarital affairs before they got married. Indeed, his lack of jealousy was one of the 3 conditions under which she married him, and he had freely agreed. Things would have ended far more quickly and easily for all involved had this deal with Dara MacFiachna, the owner of the Brown Bull, been exacted as Maebh had proposed. Indeed, MacFiachna was more than happy to acquiesce, until an unfortunate incident involving one of the messengers sent to strike the deal and his rather loose lips. Being somewhat intoxicated, he confidently stated that they'd have taken the bull, with or without MacFiachna's permission. This, naturally, put MacFiachna's back up, and threatened to bring down the wrath of Ulster upon him for making deals with such a woman. Macfiachna withdrew his agreement to lend the bull to Maebh, and Maebh was left in a terrible situation. And so, at Samhain, the turning point between summer and winter, she set out from Rathcroghan along with Connacht's army and an army of Ulster exiles to take the brown bull by force. Maev's hesitancy can be felt from her words. "Everyone leaving a lover or a friend today will curse me. This army is gathered for me." There is further foreshadowing from the prophet Findabair, who they meet early on in their journey. She tells Maebh, "I see it crimson, I see it red." Hoping that she is mistaken, Maebh questions her further, since she knows that the armies of Ulster are incapacitated due to suffering the pains of childbirth because of the curse placed on them by Macha. But Findabair's prophecy is unrelenting. "I see it crimson, I see it red." Nevertheless, Maebh seems to feel that she has no choice but to forge on in an effort to restore her right to rule. And so she and her army set out on the first leg of their trek from west to east across the Irish Midlands, a journey of at least 135 kilometres, beginning with the settlements we know today as Tulsk and Strokestown in County Roscommon. You'll remember from our first episode that the ancient roads of Ireland were dictated by the natural features in the landscape. Maev's path from Roscommon to Cooley was no exception. Her army would have had to cross many rivers, including the mighty Shannon, which they forded near the town of Longford. And in case you're wondering why she headed eastward instead of making a direct beeline for Dundalk, you might also remember that pesky row of hard-to-cross drumlins stretching from Newry to Sligo, which we also discussed in the first episode. If she crossed it too early, she'd have given her adversaries far too much notice of her arrival. And so it was decided that after leaving Granard in County Longford, the entourage would turn southwards through the town of Castlepollard. It is around this time that their route turns northwards towards Kells. The reason given in the Táin for the army's meandering at this point in the story is that Fergus MacRoth, who is both Maev's lover and an exile from Ulster, is experiencing guilt about leading such a bloody expedition towards his homeland up north, particularly knowing that the men of Ulster are indisposed in their pangs and so unable to defend their province and its people. And so he leads the army astray in the Midlands in order to buy time for Ulster. It is at this point that our own man Cuchulainn becomes involved in the fray. He isn't subject to Macha's debilitating curse due to not being a full-blooded Ulsterman, but rather a demigod, born of his mortal mother Dectana and the immortal god Lu. And so he travels south with his mortal father Sualdam and sets up camp at Crossakiel in County Meath in order to watch for Maebh and her army. As the army progresses amidst infighting and numerous plots, Cuchulainn tortures them day and night, killing many whilst he waits for the men of Ulster to arrive from their pangs and join him. Maebh berates her army for being unfit to kill the boy. Readers who are new to the story of Anton Bo Cúailnge may find it difficult to navigate the chapters, which meander almost as much as Maev's army. This is not made easier by the antiquated place names, the jumping timeline of the narrative, and the likelihood of completely separate stories which detail battles and place names elsewhere having been absorbed into what we now recognise as the story of the Táin. Personally, I found it somewhat easier to make sense of the whole thing once I'd learned the importance of storytelling in ancient Ireland. It was an entirely oral tradition until the scribes of medieval Christianity began to write it down. Stories served more purposes than just that of entertaining the listener, although this was a very important part of it too, and I found there to be a surprising amount of humour in such a tragic story. But in addition to entertainment, stories were a means of transmitting memory and ancient knowledge from one generation to the next. By knowing tales such as that of Anton Bo Cúailnge, ancient peoples would have had important knowledge about the best places to cross rivers and mountains, for example, in a time before writing and map drawing had become commonplace. There are those, such as Anthony Murphy of Mythical Ireland, who joined us in the first episode, who believed that these stories would also have been preserving important information relating to the skies, such as the movements of the sun, moon, and constellations. It is with all this in mind that we catch up to Maev's army just before they reach the famous Slí Luachra, one of the two ancient roads to Tara to have been traversed by Maebh and her army throughout the story of the Táin, and the one which will lead us to Dundalk. Having come by a less than straightforward path through Kells, Teltown and Navan in County Meath, Maebh moves north of Slane, past the ancient monument of Nouth at Brúnabonia, and fords the River Mattock, which on modern maps forms a natural border between the counties of Louth and Meath. Professor Paul Gosling, an expert on the topography of Queen Maebh's route across Ireland, believes that, since there is no mention of RD on this particular leg of the Tine, it is more likely that her army veered eastward here towards Annagassan, where a historic ford over the White River exists. And so she took a strategic coastal route which led her towards Blackrock. And it is here where we will hand things over to Professor Gosling himself, along with his two doggos, Poppy and Amber, who decided to sit in for the interview.
Boham Whale is a road that runs effectively from PJ Carroll's factory right out to one of the bad bends on the Blackrock Road. Some people would call it Sheridan's Lane. It's now a cul-de-sac running off the Blackrock Road, but it originally went right through to the Dublin Road. And that road runs along the crest of a ridge, which on your left-hand side, if you're going towards Blackrock, would drop down into what we would have called the Lower Merches and the Upper Merches, which is where a lot of the suburbs have developed around Dundalk, into Maebh Bay Estate, and a lot of the shopping malls that have been built around there and the factories. And the tradition locally is that Queen Maebh went along that road going to Cooley, very specific west to east. So when I was told this first, I was fascinated. I walked the road one morning and I met one of the Sheridan family. I told him where I was at, and he says, "Oh yeah, my granddad and my dad always said this is true." And I said, "Is it true that she was going that way and like towards Blackrock?" And he said, "Yes." And when you follow that road down onto the main Blackrock to Dundalk Road, you realise that you have reached the coast at the end of na Craigh Duva, the black rocks, and where the black rocks give way to the Lokers, as it would be called, out along the embankment. And that's where it reaches the coast. And then on the opposite shore, at Rampark, I came across a story recorded by Paddy Power, who was a teacher in the Christian Brothers. He recorded a man called Redmond McGrath, who used to have a shop, I think it was a boot shop in Church Street. And when he was a boy, he was sent out to Rampark to relations. And he remembers sitting on the shore in Rampark with a fisherman in the 1890s, and the fisherman pointing to a row of rocks going out into the bay and saying that these were Queen Maebh's stepping stones. Now, the location is 6.5 kilometres from the bottom of Sheridan's Lane. And the traverse of the bay looks to be pure folly.
Yes.
But, as you have heard, and I has picked up, that is a viable traverse. Once you know the way the water works and the tides work, and before the ship channel, the current ship channel into Dundalk was cut, that was walkable. Therefore, if you take that and extrapolate it out, you realise that the name of that in the Tine is Lehen, the broad ford. But the story of the Tine, of course, says that Lehen is named after a guy called Lehen, but in fact it's named after the broad ford. And Lehen is probably the name of Dundalk Bay, the old name, broad ford. A huge bay that was traversable and would save you hours of haulage.
When we picture Queen Maebh coming up in our chariots, we picture her going across the Newry Bridge there, or the big bridge as we call it. But yet, no, we know that not to be the case.
I know, yeah. For a big bridge, it's very small. It was a big bridge. I think it had probably 18 or 19 arches originally. It stretched from Bridge Street to the Lisdoo Arms. All of that area with the petrol station between the Lisdoo Moorland junction right back to the present big bridge is all reclaimed land. And the old road that went north from there it isn't the current road going up to Dowdall's Hill. It's the road runs to the west of it. Doylesfort Road.
Doylesfort Road, yeah.
Linked to Doylesfort Road. And Doylesfort Road was the original road coming into Dundalk from the north. Before Doylesfort Road means the present road, it veered off and would have come in at the back of the car park of the Lisdoo, crossed behind the petrol station on the road and come in obliquely to where the bridge is now.
Right. So where does that leave us for Aughcarpat then?
Aughcarpat, meaning the ford of the wagons,
yes,
or the chariots, is probably Tuberona.
Right, okay.
Where there is still the ford because of the weir that was created. And it's about 200 metres or 150 metres downstream from Tuberona Bridge. And that's a gorgeous backwater that needs to be looked at as well, because you've got St John's Well, which I see somebody is cleaning and doing up at last.
God bless them, yeah.
And that was the site of a pattern on the 30th of June. A huge festival was held there until it was clamped down by the clergy and the gentry in the 18th century. There was too many skulls being broken and drink being taken.
And it's interesting that because Tuberona, a part of the town that you don't really spend too much time in unless you live there, but yet and all, it was probably a far more significant crossing that's mentioned in the town than anything we'd be familiar with today, really.
Totally, because again, one of those little moments when you realise that you're on the right track is that when you look at the map for Tuberona, you realise that the limit of high tides on the Castletown River is only about 50 yards downstream from the ford. So the ford is where it is because it's above the tidal limit, and therefore it's not affected by the tides. Therefore, it is available to cross, whereas anything downstream is only going to be available probably for a quarter of the day. And many of the coastal routeways in Ireland and in other countries would tend to cross rivers not at the mouth of the river, but at the limit, just above the limit of the tide. So fords are wonderful places to kind of, and they're what's called liminal. So you're at the edge of something and the beginning of something else. And this is why Cuchulainn fights Ferdia at Ardee. Ardee is listed in the Irish manuscript sources as a place where killing is always permitted. It's a dark place. And even though in the story in which it arrives, Fionn McCool is hosting a warrior who's coming, whose particular aesthetic taste involves having human heads hung around the house while he's dining. And poor old Fionn is he's a problem because, he can't get enough human heads because there's a truce on in Ireland. Cormac MacArt, the High King, has called a truce and nobody's allowed to kill anybody. But then it's pointed out to me, you can always kill somebody at Ardee.
Which part of the town do you like best? What's your favourite bit?
I'm fascinated by Findabair, the daughter of Queen Maebh. If I'm not thinking about the place names, I'm thinking about her mistreatment, how she is basically offered by her mother to every warrior if they will go and fight Queen Maebh.
Yeah.
And of course she's throwing in her own friendly thighs on top of that
at
one point. So I'm fascinated by the interpretations as to whether Findabair has agency, independent action, or whether she's simply a little foil for her mother and father. All of this, of course, is within the frame of how not to rear a daughter.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm quite fascinated by that because Findabair itself is a fascinating name because until, I think, the 1960s, nobody knew what it meant. And then somebody cracked it. I think it was T.F. O'Reilly. He cracked it. It means white water. But Fionn often was taken as fair-haired. And the Avar element, A-B-A-I-R, was often brow, but he cracked it. It's an Indo-European word and it means white water. And when you read it like that, it turns up in the town as a place name and as a person's name.
Yeah.
And the white water, for instance, when Queen Maebh camps in Cooley, she camps at a place called Findabair Coolin, which is white water of Cooley. I remember looking at this a few years ago. White water of Cooley is Cooley Point, which is beyond Templetown. And it's called Cooley Point. And it's the place that would have had the most white water because it's a promontory. So therefore, it's quite clearly the place that she camped. But there is a Findabair Schleve, white water of the hill, and there is a white river in the hills overlooking Ardee from the south, near Cullen. And that's a Findabair Schleve. So this juxtaposition between the name as the name of a young woman, the name of a hill, the name of a coastal promontory, that's one of my favourite little, and you're in and out, weaving in and out of personality and action into places, which can be passive. And then she's a woman, she has agency, and she dies in Findabair Schleve. She dies of a broken heart because she realises how many warriors have died because of her mother's actions in selling her effectively. 800 warriors died fighting over her. So I find that aspect of it, which again turns up in modern storytelling about, abusive relationships between mother and daughter.
Exactly, yeah.
And of course, where's the father in all of this?
Exactly, yeah. Well, I mean, it's two large egos at play really as well, isn't it? And it's kind of when parents aren't paying enough attention to the needs of their children and the next generation and all the allegory of that. And it's funny because there's probably people driving in and out to work in the Findabair industrial estate every day in Dundalk.
I was responsible for that, by the way.
Were you? I was wondering who was, but of course it was you.
I worked for Dundalk Council in 1979-82, and they were designing the housing, the industrial estate at the time, and they asked me for a list of names, and I gave them a list. And unfortunately, I didn't give them the phonetic pronunciations. So it's called Findabair Industrial Estate.
Yeah.
its correct pronunciation would be Findabair Industrial Estate.
Yeah.
And Findabair is Finula. It's cognate with that. It's soft,
Yes.
But anyway, it's there.
It's there for us to mispronounce as much as we want.
No, it's a new pronunciation. And it has stuck,
Yeah. Well, it has a nice ring to it, even when you say it wrong, I suppose.
Exactly.
So do you find there's a big disconnection between what's actually being told in the story, the original idea behind the story, and what most of us is actually getting it by the time, as you say, it filters down through all the different versions of the story that have been written down, and then the different versions of all the versions of translations that you have to try and wade through?
So it's a bit like a script for a Hollywood movie that's in formation, and there are various different versions. And if you were to add in, various different maybe script writers and potential directors, and the equivalent of those would be the scholars who've studied the Tine and their interpretations of the story. I think that makes it complex on a series of different levels. My own entry point to it has been place names, and because I grew up in Dundalk, I started with the place names that were closest to me, places like Tuberona and Fahart and Cuchullin's Castle, for instance. And if you take the example of Cuchullin's Castle, our past in terms of structural remains is earth mounds. So Tara, for instance, is often a complete disappointment to people because on a bad day, it's just a grassy field. Even on a good day, there's very little shadow to pick out the earthen monuments. And if you transpose that to a place called Cuchullin's Castle, the first thing you have to realise that the name Cuchullin's Castle is less than 100 years old.
Yes.
And the castle referred to wasn't built by Cuchullin, it was built by a man called Pirate Byrne in 1780.
Yes.
And therefore it's difficult to match the story to the remains on the site. And if you peel away the various layers that are in that magnificent monument at Cuchullin's Castle, you find out that the standing stone in the field is the only monument visible to the human eye which is broadly contemporary or would have been there at the time of the so-called Tine.
Yes.
Everything else is post-Tine in
Yes.
terms of date. Now, Cuchullin's Castle is one of the easier ones because in the Tine it comes out as the word Dealgan. And Dealgan gives you Dealgan, and Dundalk gives you Dundalk. So it's not that hard to make the jump back. A place like Granard in County Longford, similarly, is spelt almost identical in the Tine. But after that, many of the places have changed names. So something like Kells has an Irish name, Canonis, which we would be familiar with if you were brought up through the medium of Irish. But in the Tine, I think it's called Coolsealine or Coolseabrine. And therefore, you have to you have to jump and where is that? Oh, that's Canonis. Where's Canonis? Oh, that's Kells. So it takes those leaps before you get into a comfortable position with it. And then when you go to Kells, you find out that there's very little local information about where the Tine took place in Kells. And then there's the element of the story in Kells that when Queen Maebh's army reached there, remembering that the Tine takes place in winter, that they are grounded by snow, and the snow reaches up to the tops of the wheels of the chariots. And you get a kind of a lovely feeling of a winter campaign. It's almost like Napoleon going to Moscow. And you realise the folly of the campaign, that nobody campaigns in winter. All of that, in my head anyway, begins to fall into place as there's a wonderful romance and folly involved in this whole campaign. For starters, it's to do with, as you have studied yourself, a dispute between a husband and wife over wealth, a ridiculous argument. And it ends up with thousands upon thousands of deaths. But our history teaches us that this is how wars start, over jealousies. And people pay a huge price for folly. And to a certain degree, I think that the Tine is a moral tale. It's a moral tale about how leaders and royalty should behave. But like any good soap opera, you demonstrate that by their misbehaviour. So it's the sheer amount of misbehaviour in the Tine that creates the moral line, which you, as the viewer or listener to the story, realises this is what I don't cross. And you learn that in looking at Coronation Street or Fair City. All of those soap operas are full of daily excess, which we contrast with our own lives and we take comfort out of it. And we do the same with the Tine. If you view it like that, it becomes much more close to us.
Thanks to Professor Gosling and to Poppy and Amber for joining us in this episode, and to you for coming along with us on Queen Maebh's famous path through Dundalk on her way to steal the brown bull of Cooley. Be sure to tune in next time for a lesser explored ancient landscape around the village of Inniskeen, near the border of Louth and Monaghan. We'll be exploring its ancient connection with the arts and its possible use as a prehistoric junction of sorts. We'll also be joined by Dr. Conor Brady, lecturer in archaeology at DKIT, to talk to us about the 70+ rock art panels which were excavated there in 2003. Thanks to David Bellew on sound and to Dundalk FM for their support in making this programme. I've been your host, Tine, and these are our ancient landscapes.